Welcome to a procurement podcast, The Reform Rundown, with your hosts Chris Robinson and Fleur Summers.
Over the course of this series, Fleur and I will be discussing some of the main themes and concepts surrounding the Procurement Act 2023 and what it will mean to the public sector ahead of launch. Fleur and I have a combined 40 years public sector procurement experience and will be using some of that experience to share our knowledge and insights around the Act itself.
So let's get into today's topic.
Welcome to episode 13 of a procurement podcast, The Reform Rundown. In this episode, we finalise our summary of the major themes of the Procurement Act 2023, making use of the popular, globally recognised CIPS Procurement and Supply Chain Cycle as a handrail and a point of reference.
And it's been a couple of weeks since our previous episode, and both Flo and I have been blown away by the positive listener feedback of the previous episode. And it really goes to show the prevalence and familiarity of the CIPS procurement and supply cycle within the sector and how it can be used as a roadmap to pinpoint particular themes mandated within the Act.
But before we get into that, let's pick up on where we left off in the previous episode. There's been two pieces of news that I think we need to cover off before we get started. So, Chris, I'll let you run through those.
Yes, certainly. And we'll start with the most important item of news. And that is to say a huge thank you to all our listeners who have helped us achieve 1,000 plays last week. You probably saw both mine and Fleur's individual videos just thanking all of you for your continued support. I even gave Fleur a nice shout out in mine too. Our official editor-in-chief, I really need to stop bigging you up, Fleur. It'll only get to your head, right?
That's not fair, but you're the brain box behind the script, aren't you? And making sure we stay on point.
Well, obviously, I haven't done a very good job of that this time around, have I?
Why is that?
Because whilst 1,000 plays is awesome, it's not even the biggest news, is it?
No, I forgot, actually. There is a bigger announcement that we should be talking about.
Exactly. And so at the time of this recording, and it's been around about a fortnight since the announcement from Georgia Gould, Parliamentary Secretary for the Cabinet Office, where she issued out a statement proposing that what was in effect an extension to go live from, as we all know, what was originally the 28th of October to the 24th of February next year. A proposal that seemed to be pretty quickly accepted, right?
Yeah, it seemed that way because within about an hour and a half of that statement and proposal from the Cabinet Office fired out emails confirming that the extension of time was going ahead and that the go live will be, as you mentioned, Chris, the 24th of February 2025.
I don't know, Flo, but it almost feels to me like it had been planned for quite some time, yeah?
It does.
For example, I hate supermarket shopping, but that's true enough, yeah. But I spend more time doing the weekly food shop than the time frame between the proposal statement and the actual confirmation.
Yeah, true. Shall we talk about the justification though given behind the announcement and the reasons for the delay?
No, not at all. Let's move on to no, I really do not want to be drawn on that. So let's move on to part two of our CIPS Procurement and Supply Cycle review.
Okay, so a quick recap. The CIPS Procurement and Supply Cycle, which covers the end-to-end procurement process, is a well-trodden path and tool for the sector, given how many of us have either obtained full MCIPs like Chris and I, or working towards getting there. In the last episode, we got to supplier selection to participate in tender. So I think that was about step 6 in the cycle. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what the notes I've got here for this particular episode as well. So we will move on to step 7, which is issue tender documents.
And just before you get started on that, Chris, if I do this right, and I can't get my lefts to right because it's opposite way round, but somewhere on the screen there will be the CIPS Procurement and Supply Cycle diagram, so you can all see what we're talking about. So hopefully I'll get that added in.
Brilliant, thank you, Fleur. So, and you know what, considering the Act, there isn't too much by way of change when we look at this step. And again, just to reiterate, step 7, issue tender documents, isn't too much change here, except the small matter of all your tender documents and templates needed to be updated to reference the Procurement Act 2023, including your instruction documents and terms and conditions.
You know, that's sarcastic. We all know that's got to be changed.
Yeah, and again, it's probably an opportune moment to reiterate what we said on many times in part one of the previous episode, of course, covering the cycle. But this is just our interpretation, isn't it, Fleur, of the cycle, and marrying that up to the features of the Act, right?
Yeah, you're right there. So these procurement documents, although we were joking, but all the procurement documents will need to clearly detail the process that is to be followed and the number of stages, especially if you're doing a competitive procedure, of course. So however many stages you're doing, are you having presentations, demos, site visits, however you want to run your procurement process, and especially a competitive procedure, flexible procedure, it will need to detail that out clearly, and so everyone can understand what you're going to do.
Definitely. It's quite an undertaking, isn't it, that? Just being mindful of that as you're going through your whole suite of documents and making sure that they're appropriately referenced. Because, again, I think not only that as well, but from an outside looking in perspective by way of prospective suppliers, it'll give them, no doubt, some confidence in terms of your knowledge and capabilities as a procuring body, and the fact that you have got your finger on the proverbial pulse, and you are currently attuned to what is current and relevant in relation to the Act itself. So a little bit of housekeeping, but also some real value to that. I would suggest both internally and externally facing.
Yeah, definitely.
So next step then, Fleur.
Hi, so next step would be step 8, and that is bid and tender evaluation and validation.
Yeah, and here is an ideal opportunity to revisit the conflict assessment piece and cross-reference what Fleur and I had said previously in relation to step 3, the previous recording. And step 3, of course, is develop the strategy and plan.
So yeah, step 8, this is very, very similar in terms of before, where your main evaluation will be carried out in terms of your award criteria and will be based upon the approach you defined in your procurement documents. So again, referring back to your procurement documents, needing to fully detail how you're going to award your contract and evaluate it. But assessing tenders in a competitive tendering procedure, it's the process by which tenders are assessed in order to determine, and I'm going to have to get this right, it is now the most advantageous tender is key to achieving value for money and its successful delivery of public service.
Yeah, it certainly is. And it's probably worth pointing out here that the basis on which the contracts are awarded is largely unchanged from the previous legislation, the existing PCRs, of course, when considering the narrative of the Act. Again, Flo, that's our interpretation of things in that regard. Also, this does, of course, include the change from meet to map, which you've just covered there, really, Fleur, and that contracting authorities can take wider factors than just price and technical quality into account. So ultimately the message here is to start to get your thinking caps on across the sector and share your best practice and ideas around things like innovation and future-proofing requirements.
Yeah, definitely. And then wrapping up this step at the end of your evaluation process, which needs to follow the process you detailed, you will have identified your successful supplier, which provides the most advantageous tender. Simple, do we think? Yeah.
Ish, I guess, yeah. I think step 8 and what we've just covered there in that particular step is, of course, very relevant, very pertinent, thinking about the content of the Act and the key themes that we've pulled out for that step in the cycle, for sure. Okay, then, so step 9, contracts award and implementation is how step 9 is defined. And now remember, this is mine and Fleur's take on the cycle and our interpretation of the Act. So considering this within contracting authorities, the first part of this process is likely to include the progression of any internal governance to approve the proposed outcome prior to any notifications that can be subsequently carried out.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously that can be quite a lengthy process depending on like the process that you've got to go through. But just to add to that, there are some changes in terms of contract award that we need to be aware of. And especially in terms of like assessment summaries where a competitive tendering procedure has been carried out, and prior to publishing the contract awards notice, which now starts the mandatory standstill process, there has to be the provision of an assessment summary, which provides information to enable a supplier to understand why its tender was either successful or unsuccessful. So sort of replacing your previous outcome letters.
Yeah, indeed. And a point to note here, of course, is you must provide an assessment summary to each supplier that submitted an assessed or evaluated tender and publish the subsequent contract award notice. I was thinking about this and reviewing the notes for this episode. That's quite a demand for the sector, right, Fleur?
Yeah, but I guess remember that the assessment summaries broadly fulfills the same requirement as the existing outcome letters. So they are similar. There are differences, but you're still doing a similar sort of thing. And key to note now that it will be the contract award notice and not the assessment summary that starts standstill. So this is a change.
Yeah, it is a change, isn't it? And this step is probably the most detailed for this particular episode in terms of our interpretation. And I'd say it's worth remembering that you are not required to include in an assessment summary a direct comparison between the successful supplier's assessed tender and an unsuccessful supplier's assessed tender. Fleur, a summary of what that means in plain English, please, would be helpful. I'm joking, but I think start review, it's pretty clear, or as clear as it can be, I think.
You put me on the spot there for a second.
I noticed the shock in your face. Yeah, absolutely. What? Where's he going with this?
Yeah.
One that perhaps maybe not the most easiest to explain by way of a process. But as for putting you on the spot, truthfully, you should be used to that by now, shouldn't you?
Okay, so after that bit, an assessment summary should be provided to an unsuccessful supplier, and it must include a copy of the information provided to the successful supplier explaining how its tender scored against each of the criteria. So this means that a supplier reading the two sets of information alongside each other will be able to ascertain the relative advantages.
Yeah, and that is that comparable exercise, then, isn't it? So that makes perfect sense, and almost kind of confirms what I've just previously said there. And remember, assessment summaries must be provided at the same time to all suppliers. That's a given, of course, but that of course submitted an assessed tender. Similar an approach to the outcome letters, of course, and before the contract award notice can be published, so that the suppliers have the full standstill period to consider the information provided before the contract is formally entered into.
And then just picking up as for a contract award notice and standstill. So a contract award notice informs interested parties that the contracting authority intends to enter into a public contract with the specified supplier. And as mentioned above, this now starts standstill, which is a key change. Also being a key change is that the standstill period is now a minimum of 8 working days rather than 10 calendar days. I'm going to struggle getting used to that one, but and it applies to all public contracts. So the change to 8 working days avoids the standstill period being artificially shortened by bank holidays.
Yeah, so what are we saying? No issuing out letters either just before the Christmas or Easter period, for example, which I know was a common, dare I say, trick that I certainly had been made aware of working in the sector previously, Fleur. I'm not sure how that fits with your best practice approaches and attitudes, but I think that's something that the sector used to use as a little bit of an advantage, dare I say, right?
Christmas always gets in the way. However, Christmas always gets in the way. But no, I wouldn't do anything like that.
Yeah. And we're certainly not cancelling Christmas, that's for sure. So, and talking of changes, the next change is that there will be a contract details notice, which is used to inform interested parties that a contract has been entered into, of course.
And
Publication. Yeah, it is new for sure. Yeah, and publication of the contract's details notice takes place after the standstill period has ended and the contract has been entered into. Picking up on your point there, Fleur, about it being new as part of the Act itself.
And I guess it's almost like they've taken the contract award notice, brought that forward, and then we've now got a new notice in the place of where a contract award notice used to be.
Yeah, exactly that. And the contract detail notice is required to be published on the central digital platform. Less said about that at this moment in time, probably better. But it replaces the previous contract award notice, as you've alluded to, for public contracts with an estimated value of, in fact, actually equal to or above £5 million. There is also new requirements to publish copies of the contracts, and of course, as we know, and as we've discussed in previous episodes, Fleur, the KPI set as well.
So this is the only reference where we're actually going to make reference to the Act sections in this episode, I promise. I think. So where Section 52 of the Act applies and KPIs have been set, contracting authorities must provide a description of 3 KPIs which the contracting authority regards at the time the contract details notice is published as most material to performance of the contract obligations. But then also, if it is considered that and where KPIs have not been set, the contract details notice must include an explanation of why KPIs are not appropriate to assess the performance of a supplier.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
Quite a lot there, isn't there? In terms of
there is, and I'm kind of hanging on to that last point there in terms of where KPIs haven't been set. There must be an explanation as to why they were not included and used as a mechanism to measure the performance of the supplier. I don't know about you, Fleur, but I'm struggling to think of a single instance or an actual valid excuse as to why you would not provide KPIs.
Not on a contract over £5 million.
Absolutely. So, I think you'll be clutching at straws to find a scenario or even some justification to kind of back up that idea where you've not got, or that notion that you've not got any KPIs in place for a contract. But just to finish off this particular step, so step 9, again, just to reiterate, a contracting authority must confirm in the contract details notice that a conflicts assessment has been prepared and revised as necessary. It has to be published within 30 days of the contract itself being entered into.
And breathe, I think. We've covered quite a lot there.
Yeah, hard work that. We could have probably done an entire episode on that particular step, but we've made it. So, yeah, well done, Fleur.
Okay, so the next step is step 10, warehouse logistics and receipt. And we had to get our thinking caps on for this a bit, didn't we? But I don't know about you, Chris, but it definitely brings back memories from my CIPS studies and the modules that were covered around warehouse logistics and those type of things.
Sure. And this, again, is where the relatability comes in, isn't it? In terms of the actual model itself. And perhaps maybe it might not be an area or a sector or even an example that you as a listener or me and Fleur have got actually direct familiarity of. But certainly, what I've put and what I've suggested in terms of the notes for this particular episode is more around actually things and insights I'd got from fellow learners doing CIPS at the time around this particular step. And when I stopped and listened and thought about what they had to say by way of an example, I thought, okay, I get that now. It's not relevant to the role that I had at that time when I was studying CIPS, or in fact what I'm doing now, but there is some relatability. So we did, in terms of really have to get our thinking caps on, but a point of reference here, maybe. Let's just fly with this example, hey? A supply storeroom for an NHS trust with a variety of medium to fast-moving goods and how essential those items would be. Of course, it makes it a given that KPIs and other measurements of performance monitoring could be baked into the contracts. Naturally, in this scenario, it's likely items within that storeroom would come from a variety of suppliers and therefore subsequent contracts. But this truly could be where the Act could really support in this instance the trust themselves, as greater emphasis, of course, is placed on the importance of contract management. And one might argue the sector now, or will have at least, greater powers than ever before.
Yeah, I sort of can see that scenario playing out well for the trust in that instance. Obviously, careful planning and creation of smart KPIs is key.
Absolutely. And then on to step 11, which is contracts performance improvement.
Yeah, so step 11, as Chris said, the main change that we see as part of contract management, contract performance with the implementation of the Procurement Act is the performance against the stated KPIs, which have to be published on an annual basis, whether good or bad, and sort of links into what we were just talking about in terms of the publication of what those KPIs will be on your contract details notice.
Absolutely. And this is the first time that the KPIs have been legislated for in UK public procurement, of course, as part of the Act.
Yeah, and of course, as there is a new discretionary exclusion ground which permits exclusion on the grounds of poor performance, which again is new with the Procurement Act, this places more emphasis on the setting of KPIs and assessment of performance than has previously been seen before. So where KPIs have been set at least once in every 12-month period during the lifetime of the contract, which if you think could be quite a lot, if you've got a 10, 15 year, you're going to have to do this a number of times. And on termination of a contract, whether termination or natural expiry, assess the supplier's performance and publish information using the new contract performance notice.
Yeah, and the point you just mentioned there, at least once every 12 months, there may well be instances, contracts, scenarios, particular provisions where you may feel the necessity to report upon performance on a more frequent basis than once a year. Yeah. But if you are doing that, and of course you mandate it as part of the contract, you need to hold yourselves to task to actually be able to report on performance on that stated time frame, bi-monthly, quarterly, for example, whatever that may be. But the point that you've just mentioned there, Fleur, of course, is as a bare minimum, once every 12 months within the duration of the contract. Sure. And to wrap this up, it's mine and Fleur's understanding that there are going to be set category ratings that are going to be used for this process. So good, approaching target, requires improvements, inadequate, or other. No, I'd love to see what falls under the other category, and I can't wait to see some examples trawling through the register of ones that fall under that category and what's being used for that particular category by way of a justification. Will be interesting for sure.
Although that'll be interesting, but I guess it's worth pointing out that there will need to be a bit of work by contracting authorities there, because that is a set criteria that everyone is going to have to use as part of that contract performance notice. Indeed. So there's going to have to be work that in terms of translating their KPIs and their ratings that they're going to be using and how they move over into these ratings. So there's got to be a bit of thinking there in terms of how that reporting on performance is going to be done.
Indeed.
Okay, so step 12 is supplier relationship management, and this could involve elements of contract management, and I guess the main areas linked to this in the new Procurement Act would be the managing of contract modifications. But I think I was having to think about this, Chris, but also in terms of supplier relationship management, like innovations, improvements, efficiencies, working together, those type of things could all form part of supplier relationship management and slightly linked to the Procurement Act in terms of social value, and I guess it picks back up on things that we've talked about, making sure you're getting what you set out to achieve with social value in the first, in terms of the procurement. So yeah, quite a few things, but not as easily linked as some of the other areas.
No, but you think about what we covered in the previous step 11, you can see that almost direct link as a journey moving through those steps of how you can again use the Act to align particular activities to those steps. And naturally what we've covered in step 11 and then moving into step 12 will show that clear transition and thought process from a procurement perspective. So I completely agree, in terms of the management relationship management element of what you've just said there, for sure. So and whilst not perhaps maybe directly linked to the Act narrative, we know that a contract selection type is a huge consideration when deciding upon the appropriate model forms, and in short, selecting the right form to fit the subject matter that's in fact being procured, and how subsequently that working relationship between the procuring organisation and the appointing contractor is managed and hopefully successfully grows during the life of the contract itself.
And I guess in terms of like the model forms of contracts, we're sort of talking about NEC, NEC4, like JCT, FIDIC, those type of contract forms.
Yeah, definitely. And, particularly open book, category management, professional service contracting, alliance contracting, which is popular, of course, within the sector now, and all the bells and whistles that are thrown into those types of approaches. And we could even talk about using the relationship spectrum tool, which is used to identify the correct approach. But I think really, in reality, referencing two CIPS models or approaches in one podcast is probably too much, Fleur.
Yeah, definitely. Fair comment. Okay, so moving on, and finally, step 13, asset management. Tough one this is really for public sector perspective, maybe, don't you think?
Yeah, totally agree. But obviously here, I guess you could potentially consider hire purchase type provisions and something like vehicles. But yeah, a tough one to marry up to a particular feature or theme of the Act itself.
I guess as a stretch, we could maybe link it into like building innovation into the contract to ensure like the solution in this instance could be refreshed every time something new or cutting edge comes to market, ensuring that the organisation doesn't end up with like obsolete provision maybe for managing their assets. It depends what you take as asset, doesn't it? But yeah.
Yeah, I like that. It's a great example. That'll do. And speaking
not
of
an easy one, that one.
It's not clutching at straws a little bit, but I think it'll do. And speaking of that'll do, I think that concludes our little breakdown of the Acts using or making use of the CIPS Procurement and Supply Cycle.
It certainly does, and I think over those 2 episodes, we've done quite a good job of trying to talk through the CIPS Procurement and Supply Cycle and linking it to the Procurement Act, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think we can give ourselves a pat on the back for that. I think that's a really good effort.
A few tough steps, but some were easy.
I think so. But, as ever, keen to hear the listeners' views and how they think we fared in our summarisation over the last 2 episodes. It's not been an easy one to write, that, Fleur, I can tell you.
No, some of those were really tough and when it wasn't obvious.
No, absolutely. And that just leaves me to say, keep an eye out for our forthcoming episodes. We've got some incredible guest speakers lined up over the next few episodes. Really excited for those, Fleur. A part of our, what we call in our Impressions sub-series.
Yeah, like a mini-series.
Definitely should be good.
Yeah, and we certainly have. And we've got a few more updates and changes to mine and Chris's podcast series too. So make sure to watch that space for that as well, because we're really excited to share some of this with you. But of course, we will see you in the next episode.
Bye for now.